Well, all right, Nostalgia Trappers, welcome to the program. David Parsons here. I hope all is well in your world, wherever and whenever that might be. And I hope you're ready for this conversation with Justin Rogers Cooper. We're talking about Calvin and Hobbes today. I don't know about you, but Calvin and Hobbes was a huge part of my childhood. I had every single one of those books. And as me and Justin get into in this conversation, those books now, looking back on it and doing the kind of nostalgia trap treatment of it, you know, they were formative in a lot of different ways, and I think continue to resonate. Looking at these comics this week with Justin and sort of picking out some of our favorites and the ones we remember and the ones that sort of look different from the perspective of the 21st century, all of that was sort of a mindfuck for me, honestly. Calvin Hobbes is maybe a bigger part of me than I even recognized before. And we wanted to bring on a special guest in this conversation. We talk with Justin's son, who is 8 years old. His name is Conrad Kozlowski Cooper, and he's a huge Calvin and Hobbes fan. And he came on and talked with us a little bit at the beginning here, and I think it was important to sort of frame a child's view of Calvin and Hobbes, because ostensibly it is for kids, but as Justin and I talk about throughout this conversation, it's honestly one of the most, compelling pieces of literature that either one of us encountered at that age, if that makes sense, and I think continues to be. For better or worse, Calvin and Hobbes is what we're stuck with, and I think that, you know, its place in the wider culture is something worth thinking about too. Bill Watterson is sort of one of those guys that was resisting the commercialization of Calvin and Hobbes. All those like stickers you see on people's trucks of like Calvin peeing on various other car companies and countries and stuff like that. Bill Watterson didn't sign off on any of that stuff, and he really like kind of waged a war against quote unquote selling out that also I think looks a little different considering the politics of influencers and everything else with regards to tech and pop culture. So we get into a lot in this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you like what we do here on Nostalgia Trap, please consider subscribing. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and get access to all our bonus content, including our movie club. We will be continuing our movie club meetings this January. So if you want to get in on that, now is the time. I hope you enjoy this episode. Here is me, Justin, and Conrad talking about Calvin and Hobbes. All right, Justin. Well, you and I have been wanting to talk about a certain cartoon comic strip called Calvin and Hobbes on this program for a while because, for a number of reasons, but I think it's a genuine nostalgia trap for both of us. But we had an episode earlier this year with that was actually one of my favorite episodes this year, with an author named Blake Scott Ball, who wrote a book called Charlie Brown's America. We talked a lot about Charlie Brown, Peanuts, and I have been thinking about the role of childhood and the sort of idea of like looking at politics and the world through the eyes of children. Peanuts just blew my mind, and I think that Calvin and Hobbes actually occupies an even stronger place for me personally along that vein. So it's sort of an opportunity to think about how children see the world. And I thought, what better way to get into that subject than to have a special guest expert? So, Justin, you are joining me with your son, Conrad Kozlowski Cooper, who is here to tell us a little bit about Calvin and Hobbes. Now, Conrad, you are dressed like Calvin with a Hobbes. It seems like you really like this cartoon.
I really like it, yes.
What's your favorite part about it?
My favorite part about Calvin and Hobbes is how Calvin is always making so much mischievous and like breaking all the rules with his stuffed animal.
Right. And talking to his stuffed animal about all the adventures they're getting into.
And how like he tries to do it and he like makes up things, and how like in one thing he says he has lots of common sense, but then after that he tells us that he says I have a lot, I just don't choose to use it.
Do you see yourself in Calvin? Do you think, because I'm looking at you now and you look like a real version of Calvin and Hobbes, do you see yourself in Calvin? Do you think like you're a lot like Calvin?
Yes.
What is it about Calvin that's like you?
that like I also like go insane like him.
He goes insane in a very specific way, though, right? He's always imagining that he's other characters. Do you like to do that too?
Yeah, like Spaceman Spiff for him.
Yep.
And Godzilla for you.
Yeah.
Conrad, do you want to share, David, some of what you picked out to read here?
Yes. I know that because I did some studying today. Let's see here. Where was it? It was right before this page.
This is from the Lazy Sunday book.
It's where I'm gonna read you the entire page. It says, "Here's a box of crayons. I need some illustrations for a story I'm writing. You can draw something besides tigers, can't you? Sure. Leopards, pumas, octolots, you
Awesome.
name it. Here, Dad, read this story tonight. I wrote it and Hobbes illustrated it." Okay. The dad who lived to regret being mean to his kid. Why are you pausing for? Keep reading. Barney's dad was really bad, so Barney hatched a plan. When his dad said, "Eat your peas," Barney shouted no and ran. Barney tricked his mean old dad and locked him in the cellar. His mom never found out where he'd gone because Barney didn't tell her. There, his dad spent his life eating mice and grew with every bite for 50 years. He was sorry he'd been cruel. The end. Mice, Barney's dad. You know how a lot of stories have morals to them? I get it!
So that's Calvin writing a story about his dad being punished.
Yeah, for doing something.
What?
And why'd you pick that one out?
I picked it out because I thought how funny that Hobbes did, and how his dad was like, I get it at the end of the story.
Calvin kind of uses stories to get back at his parents, huh?
Well, Conrad, I think you've done a really good job here. Is there any other thoughts about Calvin and Hobbes that you want to add, maybe before you go? Do you want to share one more passage in this book? I know that there's one.
There's another one in a book I need to get.
Well, here, I think this one you picked out about the snowman coming to life.
Yeah, but there's another really funny one.
Well, we might not have time for it. So maybe what you can do is just tell David maybe a little bit about why other people should read Calvin and Hobbes.
Other people should read this book because other people might like how Calvin is so mischievous and what he does, and how Calvin sees Hobbes as an actual animal, and what Calvin actually would do in school instead of just paying attention.
That's good.
And what would happen to you if you don't pay attention in school, and if you have a good imagination, you might end up falling outside of the school building.
That's true.
Because that actually happened in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good one.
When he was imagining he was Spaceman Spiff and trapped in a ship, he decided to jump into a cellar, which is actually the window of the school, and his teacher had to grab him before he fell out of the 3-story building.
Calvin's imagination sometimes gets the better of him, right?
Yeah.
And he jumps out of school. So I think that's a great place for us to pick up from Conrad here. So
he always tries to get out of school. When he just ran out of the school for no reason, and then he had to tell his mom that there's an oil leak at the school.
Wow.
Yeah, he's a clever guy. It reminds me of Muppet Babies, actually. I don't know if you have ever seen Muppet Babies, Conrad, but they do similar things where they like to they think what's in front of them is kind of boring, so they try to imagine something more exciting. And that's sort of the whole story, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Conrad. This was really fun talking with you. I'm glad you're a fan of Calvin and Hobbes, because you know what? I read Calvin and Hobbes at the same age, almost the same age that you are right now, and I still have the books and I still love them. They're like my favorite.
Thank you for coming on, buddy. So you're now free to go get into mischief, but not too much.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Conrad.
All right. Well, that actually, number one, I see that he's learned a few things from me about not stopping talking. So
and
good for
prepping,
him.
like prepping for the. He had like a stack of books. I wish people could see. He had like a stack of books with like Post-its marking the different pages he wanted to share with our audience.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want him to actually run and get all the other books with all the other markings, because I think that would have taken up the whole show. But he was ready for it, and I think that some of what he was talking about gets us into some of what made the strip popular, both in terms of the kind of
seamlessly moving from Conrad's point of view to our
I mean, it's not
our analysis.
I don't think it's a difficult transition, actually.
Well, that jumping out of school thing is exactly a lot of what it seems like this strip is about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you have the mischief element, but also the alter ego spaceman Spiff that Conrad just mentioned, as being like kind of a big part of what the imagination is about. I think that's worth getting back into here as well.
And for a link with our movie club, there is a film noir alter ego as well named Tracer Bullet, who calls his mom a pushy dame. And his dad is her hired goon, and it's so funny, and it's so well drawn, like amazing artwork when he does all those flights of fancy into like Dinosaur Land or Spaceman Spiff Land, or Tracer Bullet, or what is it, Stupendous Man. They're just unbelievably beautiful the way they're drawn.
I think that, one of the things that's going to pop through the conversation here for the remainder of the show is this sense that we're not just talking about a comic strip, that we're talking about an art form, and we're talking about what a lot of people believe is the sort of signal artist of the second half of the 20th century. And that would, include people like Gary Larson and Charles Schultz and others that are kind of like the big names of the field. Calvin and Hobbes took things in a different direction. And I think there's a lot for us to think about in terms of what it means to juxtapose the comic with this idea of art. And Watterson himself, we get into this later, was very invested in that. And I think there's a couple of things that I just want to say at the outset. And one of them just picking up from something else that Conrad mentioned, which is there is like an earned sentimental streak. So when Conrad mentions like Calvin's friendship with Hobbes, like the animal, that he can like see this animal in a way that's revealing not only just of like the Hobbesian reality or whatever you want to say, but that he sees in this animal a friend. And that's, I think it rings a bell with the two of us in terms of our cat friendships, and even Watterson's cat friendships, and the kind of way that Hobbes was somewhat modeled on his cat Sprite or something.
Not only a friendship, but like another consciousness.
That's like what I'm talking about.
Actually a counter consciousness to Calvin, which is interesting, because like you're imagining your own counter consciousness through this like anthropomorphic animal. It's amazing the way that because it allows him a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, and I actually think that one of the things that stuck out from one of our recent Zen episodes is something you said, where you said that people's history of the United States was kind of like this consolidation of the anti-war counterculture, that kind of in the long civil rights movement, that kind of moment of the 60s and early 70s, and like kind of where it culminated came later in this book form. And I actually think in many ways, this kind of alternative consciousness that you just mentioned with Hobbes, this counter consciousness, and then Calvin's own counter consciousness, it seems like Calvin and Hobbes in a weird way is definitely breathing fire from the legacy of the 60s, the counterculture, the anti-war movement, and that it too is this hangover from this other era. And the other thing you mentioned, and I still don't want to get into it, all of it right now, is you had texted me a couple of days ago and mentioned that there was some overlaps between Cobain and Watterson as like figures who were ultimately to different ends, but concerned with things like selling out. And when I think about our recent, 300th episode, Californication, and like what that's about, Watterson, in his repeated refusals to quote unquote sell out while still producing for a mass market, to me, that really got me thinking with what you were saying, because I was like, wow, there was this, tremendous tension in terms of like, what was the nature of art? What was the nature of genre? What was the nature of markets? How do you preserve integrity within capitalist systems? How do you produce art and not sell out? And so that's a long way to say just the thing that we've always mentioned, which is that no one gives a fuck about selling out anymore. No one. Everyone is just selling themselves voraciously as much as possible. The whole idea is to get the deal done, to get the content out there. There's not even a philosophical grappling with this. And what that makes me think of is that, Watterson's retirement in 95 and Cobain's death in 94, these are two signal ends of that long echo of the counterculture, where there was still this idea that that people were trying to produce not only an alternate consciousness within sort of the landscape of U.S. cultural capitalism, but that they were struggling with like business decisions as creators.
Yeah.
And that is gone. And so when we get into this, I really hope that some of what our conversation can be about is to think about just these kinds of themes, and as they exist as this kind of lost vision of this prior cultural moment, if you will.
Totally. I mean, it makes me think of Kurt Cobain on the cover of Rolling Stone with the T-shirt that says "Corporate magazines still suck," right? Like the contradiction was on the surface, and they were playing with it, and you don't really get that in the culture as much anymore. It feels like it's almost like I mean, I don't want to be like too like melodramatic about these figures, but it feels like figures like Watterson and Cobain, and there are a million others. I mean, I actually think those guys are just very visible figures of feelings that were embraced by a lot of people, a wide range of artists, etc. Were fighting this battle in the 90s, but it almost feels like the last battle. You know what I mean? It feels like this was the climax of that impulse of like, there's something beyond just the impulse to make money off of this stuff and merchandise and brand it all. There's some other realm like that we call art, capital A, and that exists, and that's important, and that's what we should be standing up for against these forces that are going to like wash it all out and turn it into a product. Like, it feels like the 90s was the last time that really happened, and Calvin and Hobbes were totally part of that, in part because of the spirit of the comic itself, and because everyone knew that Watterson was like refusing to give in to the forces that wanted to make, stuffed animals and stickers and, the whole sort of world of Calvin and Hobbes into a product world. And it seems like, we look at that stuff in part. I think we look to the 90s a lot, you and I, and others too, thinking about that, because it feels like, wow, it was the last time we saw that that fight really happening at that level.
Yeah, and
I mean, people. You could say people that are fighting about Bitcoin and everything right now are like kind of continuing some sort of like counter narrative or something. I don't know. Maybe we're wrong. Is what I'm saying. Is maybe there's a possibility that we're wrong. But it feels like that in the 90s culture there was a real effort to make this visible.
I'm wrong about a lot of stuff, and I think that's why we would always do this under the guise of nostalgia trap. Because like I'm trapped by the conviction that we're right. Even if we are wrong.
Yeah, you could sound like the guy that's like, the last time anything matters was at Woodstock in 1969, man. That's the last time anything matters. It's like, no, that was the last time you were 21 years old and high on your own supply. You know what I mean?
And I'd also be like, well, David, I'm not making an absolute claim. I'm merely making a historical claim, and those are two distinct claims. But I also want to say something as we get into the strip, and it's this, like pop songs, which me and you have analyzed off and on the last few years. The comic strip is an odd genre for making the case about where to find counter consciousness, if you will. And we see it in Nirvana songs, and we've made the case for Cobain among others, that within these like mass market genres, you can actually find pockets of alternative imaginings, if you will. And one of the things I thought would get us going into the comics and, whatever we both want to talk about is what Watterson himself says about comic strips, because, and I think we're going to probably pick this up next year when we will hopefully do like a Seinfeld trilogy or whatever the hell else we're doing.
For sure.
So when we're into that, part of the thing that it's made me think about a lot more is that once we're out of the realm of pop music and we're into the realm of comedy or the comic strip, you're basically trying to think, wait, what does comedy have to do with politics? What does comedy have to do with art? Because the comic art, it's certainly not celebrated at the Oscars. You know what I mean? So like, what does it mean? Here's what Watterson said. And this has been rattling around my brain. This is, I believe, at the end of his 10th anniversary book, in which he like captions and narrates a lot of like his comics over the years. Great book. It's kind of a manifesto of its own. And at the end of it, he writes, "Surprise is the essence of humor, and nothing is more surprising than the truth." And I was just like, damn, because that's a Freudian nugget right there. That's an interesting claim.
Nothing is more surprising than the truth. Yeah.
And he's saying the truth is funny. So he's saying surprise is the essence of humor, meaning the thing that's funny is surprising. So in that you can kind of get the rhythm of comedy from that. You can kind of get the sequence of the story, the gag, the punchline. But he's also saying nothing's more surprising than the truth, which is also his way of saying nothing's funnier than the truth, but the truth is also a surprise. And this is what I wanted to kind of throw out there is part of what makes it a surprise is because it's revealing something to you that you know to be true, but can't admit was true. And that's the joke, is the joke pulls back the curtain on something that you've been repressing or denying or that you don't want to think about, but you're not actually surprised to see it behind the curtain.
Right.
Because you've been fucking hiding it all that time. That's complex shit right there, and I think that's the realm that you have to start.
That's true.
Digging
It's like hidden knowledge, subconscious knowledge. It's why when people pass around like great bits from stand-up comics, they're always saying exactly this guy gets it exactly right. They're almost like saying that like the best comic is the guy that like most the guy or girl who most accurately reveals the hidden knowledge, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and it does seem political in the sense that, like, you and I are always talking about on this show, Justin, like finding the contradictions, right? Like nothing really moves forward until you find the contradiction at the heart of whatever you're talking about. And it seems like comedians are, as much as they're revealing hidden truths, they're also trying to find things that don't make sense and trying to like square that in some comedic way. And it seems like, I mean, all the way to Dave Chappelle. And like, I haven't watched that new special, so I can't really speak on it. But it's like, it's made people really, really mad. And to me, that's the fact that it's made people really mad is interesting to me, because it means that it means that people do put a lot of weight in the sort of quote unquote truths that are being said on these stages. And Netflix seems to know that. There's a lot of money in like hammering at those hidden truths.
Absolutely. And one of the strips that I thought we could just look at, and there's over 3,000 of these things.
It's amazing. So, yeah, really quickly, let me just say that. So for people that don't know or are not into this strip as much, and I didn't even realize this until I started looking at some of the information around the strip, because it's something that I didn't get into until I was a little bit. It had already started. I think I started actually reading Calvin and Hobbes in 1988 or 1989 when I was like 10 or 11 years old. They were books that you could like order. I don't know if anyone remembers like the Weekly Reader, but like you could order books like from Scholastic, and they always had like the Garfield books, the Far Side books, and the Calvin and Hobbes books. So that was like, I ordered those because I just wanted to read these comics, and I loved all the Garfields, and I loved all the Far Sides, and those are other conversations. But Calvin and Hobbes stuck out to me at a very, very young age. I was probably 10 or 11. So now, like reading about it now, I realize Calvin and Hobbes only ran for 10 years. It was in newspapers from 1985 to 1995. The entire time, Watterson is like battling with different companies and different institutions about like the style of the artwork, about the content of the artwork, etc. And he quits. He like retires in 95, and he's known as a recluse. Like he doesn't really do interviews all that much. He's done a few pieces of written material over the years. But part of the mystique of Calvin and Hobbes is Watterson himself, who's sort of this figure that refuses to engage with the sort of money media that, ironically, brought his vision to the public. So that's Calvin and Hobbes, and I spent my childhood reading this stuff. I honestly have I have all of the books. I've read every strip many times. I'm curious for you, Justin, because I know you picked some out. What are the things that stuck out to you? Because I feel like there's a lot of broad themes that come up a lot in Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of places to go, and just if we don't get a chance to talk about a lot of these close readings, it's worth mentioning things like, as Conrad mentioned, his role at school and his alienation from school. It's worth mentioning, when he uses the plain and simple cardboard box to develop this tool for fantasy. So it's the transmogrifier, but it's also the duplicator when he makes those replicas of himself. He plays doctor with Susie, but it's written in a soap opera visual style genre.
That's right.
That ends up being kind of a lampoon. It's very funny. There's also what Watterson calls his overt commentary. So especially in the second half of the strip, he starts to talk about things like the greenhouse effect. He starts to talk about climate change. He starts to talk about the natural world. He spends a lot of time satirizing American mass market culture. So there's streaks of both anti-consumerism, but what you could broadly call, and I'm not making this claim as a total claim, but there are streaks of what you could broadly call anti-capitalism in Calvin and Hobbes. And that's worth really thinking about, because I know that Watterson would probably not describe himself as an anti-capitalist. But where he makes those splits allows other people like us to sort of put our finger on some squishy issues, because he's certainly, as you just mentioned, not somebody that celebrated all aspects of the free market in his own career. But actually, there's a lot of what I guess you would call, or what I would certainly call, profound alienation in Calvin. And that part of what a lot of these kind of critical pieces or satires on American cultural economy. So for example, his little satire on the chewing gum magazine.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
And it's kind of an early way to critique algorithms that are segmenting audiences into markets. But part of what that kind of overt commentary, or those kind of direct satires of the way that consumerism works and everything else, part of what I think that's doing is that it ends up making a comic strip that's not just about an imaginative child and his friend, which is obviously what part of this is all about. The word imagination gets thrown around a lot in terms of explaining the success of this strip. I think I would actually draw another word in there. I would use the word fantasy. And I think that part of what this whole strip is about, and I'm sure this will come out through some of the close readings we do in a minute, is that the strip, to me, can be read as the sort of emergence of personhood that's profoundly alienated. And it's directly tied to the kind of alienation, not just from the capitalist market economy, the modern world, but it's here's a kid that's alienated from school. He has this kind of alienated tension in his family life, and he's able to escape that through fantasies with his friend Hobbes, where they go out, and it's through this fantasy world, fantasy life, the alter egos of his fantasy, that he develops strategies for managing his alienation. And I do mean alienation here, in the classical Marxist sense, but also beyond. And so his alienated self sort of finds relief and evolution and attack and repair in this relationship with Hobbes. And so part of what I see happening here is, number one, alienation starts well before work. And school is the factory.
And before puberty, honestly.
Yes.
People often associate puberty with the moment where of loss of innocence, and that's where all the trouble begins. But it feels for me at least, the alienation is identifiable well before that moment.
And the reason it is because the school is the factory. So in Marx, the worker was alienated making shoes in the factory. But the shoe factory in Calvin and Hobbes is the school, and also the house, where these rhythms of getting ready for school, eating dinner, doing your homework, doing your chores, and then going to school and everything's clocked out by periods. We often use the school as a literal kind of analogy for the factory, like schools are warehouses for bodies before they go to work in the factories. And people often critique the school as this like 19th century invention that's like a factory. Okay, fine. But part of what Calvin is also showing and what you just acknowledged is this alienated self, number one, is alienated well before the age of quote unquote work. But number two, the whole domestic economy of the house isn't a sanctuary from the alienated factory life of the school and modern world and the capitalist oppression, etc. But it's felt everywhere. It's fully subsumed. And so one of the ways you manage to release yourself and find relief from this like ever all penetrating capitalist reality is by fantasizing that you're controlling it and getting away from it and actually overthrowing it.
Yeah, or that you're living as a character from a piece of fiction.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that you know, I don't know which ones you chose, but I'll share one right now that I saw this morning because I think it fits very well with what you're talking about, and you probably remember this one. It's a Spaceman Spiff, and Spaceman Spiff has landed on a planet that has no food on it, and he's roaming around the planet and he's starving, and he's hoping to chase one of these like alien creatures that might be like he said there's a fresh kill nearby, you know, maybe there's something that we can eat over there, but then he gets there and it's like it's a rotting, disgusting carcass, and he can't eat that, and he's eventually like just crawling along this planet as he's starving to death, and then it flashes to what is actually happening, and he's sitting with Susie in the school cafeteria, and he's chosen an ice cream sandwich, and he's like this, and she's telling him, you shouldn't eat an ice cream sandwich for that's a bad lunch to eat, and he's like, Spaceman Spiff will at least survive one more day, you know. And I thought that was such a funny and amazing like depiction of that predicament, but it's also about like a kid at school like starving and like not having food that he wants to eat around, and he's just like I mean he's really it's a comment on like this institutional culture of school feeding, but it's such an intense like rendering of what that tension is, and I loved it. I think it goes along with what you were just saying. Absolutely, perfectly, and that's awesome. And it's funny because I didn't know what Conrad was going to talk about, and I didn't know what you were going to talk about, but it all does click together in ways that I think is really productive. And one of the second books, so this is like probably the first half of his career, Attack of the Deranged Mutant Killer Monster Snow Goons. I learned that this book was on the like top 10 bestseller list, like in '88 or like in the late '80s for like well over a year. Who was reading this stuff? Is it because it's kind of ostensibly for kids? And I know we had Conrad on here, but I'm also like I kind of had to stretch to read it when I was a kid. There's a lot of big there's a lot of big words in this. It's like very. I mean, he goes into like academic jargon. Both Calvin and Hobbes speak in a way that's like way, way elevated. Like Calvin doesn't sound like a 6-year-old boy. Like no 6-year-old boy has ever talked in the way that Calvin does. It's weird because it's like it's both like this uncanny depiction of what childhood is actually like with this sort of meta commentary of the child itself. That's really well said. And you can see that even on the first page of this book because Calvin gets the chicken pox and he's at the doctor. And the doctor's like, yep, that's chicken pox, all right. And Calvin's like going insane and he's like, chicken pox? Mom, what is this guy, a veterinarian? You know, and it's like, that's one style of humor, you know. And then the doctor continues like in a deadpan, the virus should run its course in about a week. And Calvin's continuing like in his own little world to go bananas. And he looks a lot like Charlie Brown, by the way. Totally. And that's kind of intentional. And he says, he's mad, I say. I'll bet the real doctor is tied up and gagged in the other exam room. And you can really start to see like his imagination kind of go wild here. But you can also see that like this flight of fancy is cinematic and spectacular and sort of epic and kind of hilarious as an exaggeration. And the doctor continues, he's extremely contagious, so keep him away from other kids. Sue him, Mom. Drive his malpractice insurance up. Now that's the moment where he reveals what you're saying, which is like, wait a minute, no 6-year-old kid knows about malpractice insurance, like not at least like this. And so finally, the mom reacts. She's looking, again, has a kind of Schultzian, emoticon expression here. And she goes,
Calvin has to be inside for a week. And then like in a Parks and Rec or Office like aside, the doctor says, that's a nasty twitch you've developed. And this ability for the words to refer to something that we can't see in the medium is part of what makes a lot of the strips work, is that it refers to things that are happening like off camera, if you will, or off panel, or it refers to motion that the graphic image actually can't depict.
It's like watching a cartoon, actually. There is a physicality. I'm not like really adept at reading comics. I'm not a huge comic person. I love certain comics and graphic novels, and I do read them, but I'm not like, I don't feel like I'm one of these people that just like consumes them and is a mega fan, because I know people are into that, like their whole life is graphic novels and comics. I read the stuff that like appeals to me, and Calvin and Hobbes sort of like the I don't know, there's something kinetic about the way that the experience of reading Calvin and Hobbes, it moves. Aside from all the like, you know, the words and the Calvin's like elevated language, there's also like a real sense of, I don't know, physical comedy in it. When especially Hobbes as like a figure is like darting around, you can really like, I don't know, feel that while you're reading it. I think it's part of the pull of the narrative, actually.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I think that leads us to I know we can't do this the whole show, but I have one other I won't necessarily read it, but I have one other sequence I want to share with you. It's in the 10th anniversary book, and I think it's well known among Calvin and Hobbes readers, and it's the early sequence, if I'm remembering correctly, about when Calvin and Hobbes find the dying raccoon, and how it's revealing because number one, it shows his parents in a different light. They're not like conflict foils. They're also helpers and guiders. And I think that they play, in some ways, a almost traditional sitcom role that parents normally play for kids at different moments throughout the strip. And this is one of those moments. And he runs and gets his mom. They take the little raccoon home. And there's several sequences of like Calvin and Hobbes thinking about the dying raccoon in this little box. And Calvin, who is this like insane troublemaker, rude, offensive, like bratty, snide, snarky, like for all those other things, one of the things Watterson always says is you can't put him on a mug because these characters are too complex to reveal in one moment. And here's a moment where I think that shows up because it shows him crying. He's just crying, and he says, "Don't die, little raccoon. It wouldn't be very grateful of you to break my heart." And Hobbes is crying too. And that's the end of that strip. And it's like kind of like,
wow.
It's an earned sentimentalism, I would argue, meaning like it's pathetic and full of pathos, but it's not like I'm not saying that as a criticism. It's not funny. And it's a little bit more operatic. And
well, look, I mean, when he does that sentimental stuff, I think when you say earned, I think I know exactly what you mean, because it hits you really hard because he uses it sparingly, but he does often enough. I think that's part of the maybe one of the most important parts of the strip is that through line of sentimentality that comes back every once in a while, and you realize that Calvin is just a lost little kid.
Well, and so I want to offer you two more little pictures from this part of the narrative, and then I'm going to read something to you because I think this connects back with something that you mentioned on the Schultz episode. So in the rest of the strip, basically the raccoon dies. Calvin cries a lot, and his dad's comforting him. And Calvin says to his dad, "I'm crying because out there he's gone, but he's not gone inside me."
Ugh.
Wait, that's why he's crying? So like, he's not even just crying because the raccoon died. It says, "I'm crying because out there he's gone."
Yeah.
But he's not gone in here. That's sophisticated for anyone to ever say to me. That's never, I can't, if you said where else in all your reading of fiction do you encounter a character that says that? Well, I can name you similar situations, but no one's ever said it just like that. And so then later when he's with Hobbes, he's still kind of crying, and they're taking a walk through the woods, and the woods is like this totally important, like almost Thoreauian setting.
Very, very important, the woods.
And Calvin says to Hobbes, still in a sad, awful, terrible way, "I'm happy I met him." And he sniffs and he goes, "What a stupid world."
Oh,
and it's like, there's
Jesus.
something,
So dark and so profound. Yeah.
And familiar about that. And it's like this idea that not only any of us, but including us and a child, would think to themselves, this thing was really, really upsetting, but it was so profoundly meaningful.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm glad it happened.
Yeah.
That is not that's not in commercials. Like that's not in marketing. That's
the price of experience is loss. The price of wisdom is loss. And that's something that is really, really intense there and rendered so simply. The idea that like I'm really, really sad over the raccoon being gone, but at the same time, I'm glad to have met him and known him is, that's the whole thing.
And if you've lost even a pet, like the personhood of our pets, these little family members we have, it's often sometimes hard to empathize with other people's pets when they're lost. I mean, if you knew the animal, it's a lot easier, and a lot of us go through this. But when the pet is yours, when it's your Hobbes in a certain kind of way, and here it's the raccoon, but when it's your pet, it's like a devastating loss of a person. And so it's this attempt to grapple with these larger things. And here's what I'm gonna just read you a sentence.
And all of this, honestly, as you're reading and we're thinking about all this, it's making me think of Peanuts too, which is totally Watterson, who wrote to Charles Schulz when he was a kid and felt a connection to it, both like spiritually and artistically. It comes through it because there's something about kids going through these things, like almost like recognizing them for the first time. And languaging them for the first time that is so fucking pure and dark. I don't know if you've seen the Peanuts like Christmas specials. Like I was in the there's something with that like music to it and the world they create of the kids alone and the adults sort of like tangentially there if at all. It really recreates for me something that I've never really shaken, which is the real loneliness of being a kid, the feeling of like that you are like somehow, it's weird because you're so taken care of as a kid by adults. At the same time, you feel like almost like maximally alone.
One of the words you used in that Schultz episode when you were talking to, what was the author's name again?
Blake Scott Ball.
Yes. One of the words you used was haunting. There was something haunted about Peanuts and haunting about even Charlie Brown and those relationships. And that stuck with me. And when I was reading this book, one of the books of the two that I read preparing for today, aside from Calvin and Hobbes, was this book, Let's Go Exploring by Michael Hangston. And early on when he's talking about the success and the appeal of Calvin and Hobbes, he writes this, and it'll get to something akin to what you're saying. It says, when Calvin is forced to interact with the people around him, his parents, his teacher, the girl next door, he comes off as aloof, scattered, gross. It's only when he's on his own, trudging through the forest behind his house, stuffed tiger in tow, that Calvin can truly be himself. This makes for a comic strip that is thrilling, hilarious, and impossible to predict, and yet one that is also tinged with a distant sense of sadness. And I think that, part of what accounts for the popularity of Calvin and Hobbes as a comic strip is that it's so fucking sad.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that we can relate to, and that one of the kind of weird...
Same with Peanuts, honestly. They're both they're both super depressing. I mean, I was in the grocery store the other day, and the Peanuts music came on. They're like, na 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 na, and I was immediately like, I'm like, what the guy that Elaine dates on Seinfeld that hears Desperado, and he like can't hear anything else. All of a sudden, he's like transported to another land. That was totally me in the grocery store, sitting there looking at the potato chips, heering the Vince.
You were Charlie Brown.
Yeah, the Vince Gilardi music, and it's just there's something I really. Haunting is the right word. Nostalgia trap is another one, honestly, because it is time travel. It like transports me to a different place and a different like emotive sort of landscape, if that makes sense. Like I don't know, the whole world that they live in, that these kids live in, both at Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts, it's this world that's supposed to be like middle America, it's supposed to be just sort of like the suburbs. These aren't urban stories. There are stories of kids that live like sort of close to nature. And that sort of almost reinforces the archetypal alienation of it. They're like sort of in this world that's all their own.
Yeah, and I think that there's a couple things there, and I want to actually start to connect this to what we know about Watterson's own like battles with his syndicate and his
I have a comic that will allow us to make that transition. So whenever you're ready.
Totally. And part of what I just want to point out is that, number one of the things that thus makes this peanutsy Calvin and Hobbes so appealing is the fact that we recognize not only our own forms of alienation, but our own forms of like fantastic escape from that alienation. And that might, by the way, signal to us a little bit more about why pop music and comic strips mean as much as they do to us as alienated selves. That it's not just about recognition, but the content of those texts is actually about strategies or reflections of how we manage that alienation. And I think that
and we talk about that a lot. Like what Bible in pop culture did you find? That sort of you attached yourself to or attached itself to you and like sort of provided a path out or deeper in or whatever. It feels like that's pretty important, that there are sort of like these little pop culture pathways. And I think part of the reason I like doing this show and talking about pop culture with people is like recognizing that other people also like had similar paths, or they found like some other book that I didn't. And because I didn't find that book, like they have a different, like that set them off in a different set of like places and thoughts and ideas. That to me is fascinating. Like I found Mad Magazine when I was a kid, and that was important to me. But if I had found something else, maybe I would be a different person or have a different set of values. That stuff to me is really, really endlessly fascinating.
And I think that part of what I would sort of want to wager here is the theoretical implications of that, because as I do with all these shows, I keep circling back to a couple main points. But one of the things I want to kind of emphasize in the show like this is, if middle class, suburban or rural-ish or middle class kind of normie suburban kids like Charlie Brown and his gang or like Calvin and Hobbes, if they're alienated, we've got a big problem on our hands, because it means that the homes and the houses and the worlds we've constructed that are actually worlds of like material abundance, they don't actually give our lives the kinds of meanings that we need to feel like we're alive. And so
Betty Friedan called it a comfortable concentration camp, the suburbs. And that was in 1963. So it seems like that discourse has been around for a while. The idea that these places have, they're environmentally, atmospherically, we're setting something up that's dangerous to mental health.
Yes, and that when you look at Calvin as for all intents and purposes, like a little white male who is supposed to be in the pocket of privilege, historically speaking, and this kid, it comes off this way, it's like it's a 5-alarm fire. And so, part of the connection I see between that alarm going off and the era in which Watterson was writing, which is the rise of school shootings and everything else. I'm not drawing a parallel between the character and what happened. I'm saying white men are profoundly alienated, and Calvin is actually, through all of his insanity and like through all of his offbeat, wacky, weird, gross, obnoxious ways, he's still actually ending up in a really constructive, almost reparative place. And what the problem we have to kind of ask ourselves here is, and this is especially damaging in terms of a 21st century conversation and ways we've talked about before, is if the people of privilege are this alienated in ways that are going far more violent, far more profound than Calvin, if the privileged pockets, if the privileged worlds are turning into these like camps of despair, and I don't know how far we actually want to push that metaphor, but if the worlds that we're making of material abundance are this savagely stark for so many, not only do you have a problem with the world that is made up and the economy that makes those worlds, but it means that again, going back to classical Marxism of the 19th century, it means you got a lot bigger problem on your hands than the fucking factory. Does that make sense?
I was going to say, it's like capitalism. People think the problem with capitalism is that it creates poverty, but it's like, no, it creates affluence.
There's a lot of problems. Yeah, affluence itself is another problem. And
right.
Yes.
And I was totally thinking that too. And I agree with like, how far do you go with that? Because you're kind of wondering like, oh, are we supposed to be just sort of like charmed by Calvin, by the idea that like, here's this kid who like finds a way to imagine fantastic things and comfort himself in a pretty boring world, in a pretty boring and alienating world. But part of me also like thinks about, this is the environment of the school shooter. So is Peanuts. And when you're talking about like from one perspective, Calvin is an unstable kid who's like kind of like schizophrenic, like he's like losing his mind. He's like living in all these alternate worlds because it's the only way he can deal with his reality. There almost is like a dark, gothy teenage sequel to Calvin and Hobbes that you could make that kind of goes away from the like charming Muppet Babies style of use your imagination to Imagineer yourself out of misery. It seems like there's something darker. And, let's talk about Watterson, because it feels like Watterson is a character that really does grapple with all of that stuff. I do have this comic that I think will transition a little bit to how serious a guy Watterson is and how he snuck and didn't really even sneak, just like made all these really intense sort of philosophical and political statements in Calvin and Hobbes in these newspapers. This is a pretty famous comic that it's Calvin is sitting writing up an assignment with for his school with Hobbes, and he's saying, "I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realized that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be an intimidating and impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report? The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes. Academia, here I come." So I'm like, this guy's roasting us, and like
literally, yeah. I feel it. I feel that burn.
But he does a lot of that sort of stuff, and obviously, like a 6-year-old is not going to be able to like. I mean, a 6-year-old making those kind of arguments is absurd. But at the same time, it's sort of like a hallmark of what Watterson was doing, was seeming like he was in the culture wars, and he was like not really on one side or the other. He was sort of roasting both sides like that. Academia, commercialism, all sorts of different like sort of breeds of pomposity. He was attacking. I
actually hear in that strip that you just read and in some of Watterson's vibe, I hear a little bit of George Carlin.
Totally.
Because he was a flawed comic with a lot of truth behind him too. But he also did some stuff with language, as a lot of comics do. And kind of wanted there to be how do I say this? He insisted on a lot of straight talk. And so I think part of what Watterson's beef was in a passage like that, or maybe even Calvin's beef, was there's a little bit of fussiness around language sometimes that I think obscures some of the punches that people want to make, and sometimes I see it as much a battle with form as content. And it's not coincidental that Watterson was a comic strip writer who revised all these strips over and over and over again and threw away half of the work that he made because it didn't meet his standards, and that he was so interested in capturing precision with language and with drawing. And he was actually a great verbal textual artist in addition to being just a great like visual artist. One of the things that he says, and when we think about Watterson, this is kind of what I want to focus on a little bit, is whenever he's talking about Calvin and Hobbes, he's talking about economics. Like just continuous protest against newspaper economics, syndicate economics, and he gets pretty explicit with it, almost more so than in the strip itself. So in this 10th anniversary, when he's writing this kind of manifesto-y intro and conclusion, he writes, because comics are frequently assumed to be children's entertainment, and because comics must attract a huge and diverse readership to be profitable, there are editorial constraints as well. Controversial subjects and opinions are rarely tolerated. So there's this idea about like, what can you say within the genre, but also what can you say within like this kind of corporate controlled market. And he goes on the next page and he kind of lays out the players, and he says, because of all these developments, and he's been talking about like newspaper economy, television, etc. Because of all these developments, the traditional relationship between cartoonist, syndicate, and newspaper has been strained. As circumstances change, each party tries to protect its own interests. Dude, this is like pretty clear economic analysis that's on par with the, everything I read in the normal papers on a daily basis. But also like this sounds like a history of the cartooning industry.
Well,
and
hold on a second. We know that he went to school. And Watterson graduated from a political science department from, I think it's at Kenyon College in Ohio, a private liberal arts school. And he actually named the characters Calvin and Hobbes, he says, as a tip of the hat to his poli-sci department. So, I mean, this is a guy that at least has an undergrad degree in political science. I think that we can expect that he does have a little bit to say about the economics of the industry.
However he got there, dude, I mean, this is pretty astute analysis by anyone's stretch. So it's just kind of like, it's one of the things you realize when you read Watterson and when you read books on him, as opposed to the strip itself, is, wow, the reason the strip is doing what it's doing is because this is a deeply thoughtful person who's actually highly critical about the culture around him, but also extremely cognizant about the political economy of the medium in which he's working. And he goes on in this section called licensing to say the more he thought about it, the less he liked it. He spent these 5 years fighting my syndicate's pressure to merchandise my creation. He thinks the idea of like a coffee mug illustration would be a great violation. And he goes on to say, my strip is a low-tech one-man operation, and I like it that way. I believe it's the only way to preserve the craft and to keep the strip personal. And then he continues, beyond all this, however, lies a deeper issue: the corruption of a strip's integrity. All strips are supposed to be entertaining, but some strips have a point of view and a serious purpose behind the jokes. And he kind of goes on, and on the next page says, if I were to undermine my own characters through the licensing and merchandising, if I was to undermine them, I would have taken the rare privilege of being paid to express my ideas and given it up to be an ordinary salesman and a hired illustrator. I would have sold out my own creation. And I just think that this is not the only place where he really digs into this idea.
Yep.
But dude, that's basically saying, number one, there is a point at which like capitalist intellectual property destroys not only art, but it destroys the content. And that today is one of those things that we were saying at the beginning of the show is remote as hell in conversations.
But he has
content creators.
But the other part of me is like a death of the author guy. And I wonder what you think of this, Justin. Is sort of like, well, who the fuck are you, Bill Watterson, to have any control over the meaning of your artwork once it goes into this horrible machine and people take it and turn it into whatever they want to? And in fact, that is what has happened, dude. Like when you look at like, and he made a comment about this. He said that I think actually indicates that Watterson knows that he doesn't have control over it. He's like, little did I know that like the public would really want to see like Calvin urinating on things like Ford trucks or whatever. The one I just sent you was Calvin urinating on liberals, that I saw like, on some dude's truck in front of me in traffic the other day. And it's kind of like, it kind of sucks. It's kind of sad. Like when like the fact that I only see Calvin in public as like this like figure like pissing on things that has really very little to do with the strip and actually seems very far from the spirit of the strip and is exactly what you're talking about, like washed it out.
But it's also exactly what he was talking about. So, even as I acknowledge it, like there's in no world is Calvin just merely anti-liberal. In fact, many of his values seem to be positively liberal values. And I mean that like in a philosophical, not just economic or political tradition.
Mm-hmm.
He's a creature of the liberal arts par excellence, especially in his Thoreauian attitude towards modern commerce, which is, I was surprised that I didn't see Thoreau showing up more often in some of this work. And look, the other thing I want to say now that you mentioned that, but then I want to hit back maybe two things about Watterson before we kind of try to wrap up here is Mike Conrad, who we heard from at the top of the hour, has a stuffed Hobbes doll that's like illegally merchandised.
It looks official.
And yet I've heard Conrad in his room with the door closed talking to the doll. So it's like, wait a minute, dude. So like if, there's a lot of stuff that I probably think and I've said here and that I would say that Watterson himself wouldn't agree with, and that's cool with me. I'm not like looking for that. However, if in all of our agreements and disagreements, I could just point something out to Watterson, and it's not a critique of his decisions, which I actually respect in the way that we just talked about with Cobain. Anyone who's grappling with this, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Totally.
But within that respect, which I think is pretty fucking rare and almost historical in its rarity. The thing that he didn't want to happen was this kind of one-dimensionalizing of his own characters. This idea that like it's shameless and crass. What I hear with Conrad's experience of his own imagination of Calvin and Hobbes is something that I think he would actually say is consistent with the Calvin in his strip, or consistent with the meaning of his strip. Like, in other words, Conrad uses the toy as a tool for fantasy. And isn't that part of the point of the strip that he's making? You know what I mean? And so part of what I think is happening here, though, on an even broader level, as opposed to just the irony of pointing this out, is it tells us why there is so much merchandising around the intellectual property of these like fictional stories. In other words, like one of the biggest businesses in the world is art. And one of the biggest businesses of the world is mass market art. I'm not talking about Picasso shit or, Frida Kahlo. I'm talking about Calvin and Hobbes. I'm talking about Marvel. I'm talking about Star Wars. I'm talking about all these like vehicles for fantasy. And so that one of the kind of things that Watterson's fight tells us, and that Conrad's fantasy tells us, is number one of the ways that capitalism tries to account for its production of mass alienation is through giving people all the time new tools for fantasy. And number two, the directions we go with those productions are not necessarily all in the interests of capitalism and profit, meaning it's that old Marxist dialectic, so that part of the nugget that we get isn't just the snake that eats its own tail, or us being served our own shit back to us simply to reproduce the ruling class and the people that have the copyrights. Part of what we're seeing here is that in the spaces that are opened up in the fantasy life, there is so much material for us to begin to imagine not only an escape, but other worlds. And so I think that that's the art that Watterson, I think, is trying to preserve, or some of the message that he's trying to preserve.
And other worlds that are present in our worlds, like overlapping our worlds, like the sort of easy slip that Calvin makes between his imaginative world and the real world is something that Watterson, I think, wants to call attention to. The idea that it's like sort of the dinosaur world is right there.
Absolutely, totally. And I just have two more things to share with you to see what you think. One of them is at the Festival of Cartoon Art in October 1989, Watterson made his big speech, and it's where he separated himself from the cartoon community, and everybody was like, I was doing my best David right there.
And this is the Dylan playing the electric guitar moment.
Yeah, totally. And one of the things that he says at the end of this speech is, and this is to a room full of syndicate people, agents, newspapers, cartoonists, he says, newspapers can do better. Syndicates can do better. Cartoonists can do better. The business interests, in the name of efficiency, mass marketability, and profit, are catering to the lowest common denominator of readership and are keeping this art form from growing. Whoa. You know, that'd be like me going to a academic conference and being like, it's your fault. It's all your fault. You know, like, and then he walks away.
It would be like saying, like, ladies and gentlemen, the university is dying. And the people who killed it are the people I'm looking at right now.
Like, it's just like, it's a bridges burned. And yet these people, when this author, and by the way, the author of this book is Nevin Martell. The book is called Looking for Calvin and Hobbes. It's a delicious little read. It's a quick read.
Cool.
And that's where I was getting some of this information. This is the guy that did to me all the research. But when he talked to these cartoonists afterwards, they were like, look, however much we don't disagree, or however much we disagree with what Watterson's, like, you know, the politics of all this stuff that's coming out is, there's no way to deny he's basically the most influential cartoonist of our lifetimes. Kind of, you know, this is that mid-90s moment into the 21st century. And that's just one thing that I wanted to point out, because he says profit. That is a valence of anti-capitalism that is worth understanding in the context of that alienation we've been talking about.
Yeah, and let's be old men at the end here and think, like, is there anything like Calvin and Hobbes? Is it really the last time that this sort of thing happened? I don't know. I wonder what people think. Like, what is the Calvin and Hobbes or Peanuts? What is the, like, archetypal children's thing? Like, when I think about, like, Calvin and Hobbes next to, like, I don't know, Family Guy or something, I'm like, it's not quite the same level of engagement. I mean, I don't want to make, like, I know these are subjective judgments. You know, people like what they like. But at the same time, Calvin, I think part of what we wanted to talk about is that you and I, and we're not the only ones, see something really unique about Calvin and Hobbes, really profound and different that does correspond to a classic work like Peanuts. And I'm trying to identify, like, what is it that makes Calvin and Hobbes or Peanuts pop in such a deep, deep way that, like, things like Family Guy don't really touch. I know
sadness.
That's
right. Part of it.
It is, right? Like, there's something really dark. I mean, when I think about that Peanuts Christmas special, I'm like, that's the kind of shit you listen to, like, on your deathbed. That's like, you know, that's like really, like, deep, intense stuff that touches an almost ancient place in you. And I feel like Calvin and Hobbes is playing with the same register.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the cool social commentary comedy that I think is on Family Guy or even The Simpsons, a lot of it's kind of like gag punchline, gross, you know, it's kind of like,
it's the humor is what people care about.
Kind of like, wah, wah. You know, it's like, you know, like, oh, that, you know, it's funny, but it doesn't create the same ambiance of affect
or pathos.
It does not. And pathos is, people struggle to produce pathos responsibly and productively, which is why I was calling it at the beginning of the show earned sentimentalism,
right?
Like, an earned affect,
right?
I think that's actually pretty hard to do, and a lot of I don't want to sound too weird here, but it's sometimes hard to find that in, like, traditionally masculine texts, whereas Calvin is both the kind of gross out male boy dude that you kind of expect him to be in a stereotypical way, but he also flashes, I don't mean this necessarily sexually, but he flashes some queer moods, like 19th century queer. Like, he flashes some, like, otherness that is oddly appropriated by those, like, alienated white guys with the trucks. Because
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that, honestly, one of the things that drew me to Calvin and Hobbes, I remember, is, like, I saw there was a queer girl that I had a crush on. I always had crushes on the lesbian girls in high school. It's a lifelong thing, and there's a lot to interrogate there. TMI at the end of our program, but either way, I had a crush on this girl, and she was into Calvin and Hobbes, and it was like sort of like I identified her and, like, Calvin and Hobbes and the sort of, like, counterculture punk element, if that makes sense. Calvin was part of that. People that are younger might not understand that in the early 90s and in the 90s, Calvin and Hobbes had a sort of hip cachet about them that was like Nirvana, that was, like, a little bit different than everything else that was out there. It wasn't like Garfield, right? Like, Calvin and Hobbes had a sort of charge to it in the culture that was a little bit different.
Yeah. One of the other things that I think this makes me come back to is how reclusive Watterson has been the last 30 years or, however long it's been.
J.D. Salinger.
Yeah, Salinger. There's all these comparisons and, we don't have time to go into it today, but definitely his kind of contempt for fame is bound up with the same positioning or valuation of integrity that he associates with the strip itself. And I think it goes back to, this is the last thing I want to draw on just to kind of think about in terms of Watterson and but also the world of Calvin and Hobbes. And in that book by Martel, he picks up on a couple things that Watterson wrote that I locked into and sent you guys a couple texts about recently. He writes, he knew that to create a successful strip, he would have to concoct characters in a premise that could ultimately write themselves and not become stale within a few months. And then below that, Martel summarizes, and he's quoting from Watterson throughout here. So I'll just go to the Watterson quote. Watterson says, I wasn't sure Calvin and Hobbes would be able to maintain that intensity on their own, but I tried it, and almost immediately it clicked in my mind. It became much easier to write material. This is at the beginning. And he continues, their personalities expanded easily, and that takes a good 75% of the work out of it. If you have the personalities down, you understand them and identify with them. You can stick them in any situation and have a pretty good idea of how they're going to respond. Then it's just a matter of sanding and polishing up the jokes. But if you've got more ambiguous characters or stock stereotypes, the plastic comes through and they don't work as well. These two characters clicked for me almost immediately, and I feel very comfortable working with them. And this idea that the characters are writing themselves,
yes,
that he's identifying with them, that he's working with them, to me, this tells us something that I always like to talk to my students about, and maybe I've shared with you and others over the years, which is, I often understand literary texts as writing themselves with the author as the tool. And so it kind of calls into question like capitalism's insistence on intellectual property. And it also kind of says to some people who are looking for like this additional meaning or comfort in Watterson himself, Watterson is in some ways like the recipient of this like matrix and nexus of forces that's actually Calvin and Hobbes writing themselves with Watterson's help.
He's a Woody Guthrie. He's just a channel. He's just channeling this stuff. I mean, it does feel that way, honestly.
Well, and like I think we can think of other artists in music and literature where this same kind of the song that writes itself. We just saw that tweet about Get Back or JoJo, whatever
with
it was.
McCartney, which is okay. So everyone's talking about this clip of Paul McCartney playing, like just pulling the song Get Back, quote unquote, out of midair. And you and I watched that, and you and I both like strum the guitar a little bit, and we both understand that like if you get into a certain sort of mode, you like these songs can pop out of you. It's almost like watching that clip is watching Paul McCartney's skill at opening the channel, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Rather than like just like his skill at just being a genius and creating a song, it's more a skill of like how open he is to like hearing the song and then pulling it out of that wherever it lives. Which is the creepy part to me, is that there's like this well of amazing songs and literature and art that seems to exist, and any human being could like open up and a channel and tap into it and extract something for us. That to me is a vision of what art is. And I feel like, Watterson definitely feels like he was working in that vein.
And that tapping into like this like sociality, this like cloud of the social, this like collective thing is part of the reason why like intellectual property sometimes is so obscene. But there's this tension between like the work of the artist, like the labor involved, and like the necessity of space, the necessity of money, the necessity of selling out to some degree. And what Watterson and what Calvin and Hobbes seems to me is saying is, look, he did not enjoy his work before Calvin and Hobbes. He was like doing this graphic layout shit, and he wanted enough money to tap that channel. But what he was really concerned about was if you start thinking about how you're going to sell that channel, it does damage to the world that's creating itself through you. And so the part of what the responsibility
because it's coming from a non-capitalist space.
Yes.
And so you're like trying to convert a non-capitalist art that's coming from the ether, where it's coming from the great mystery, that's coming from God, whatever, and then trying to form that into like some object that can be sold.
Yes. And it does seem like some people can design the world continuously with the kind of mass market pressures that are involved, but clearly some people can't. And what Watterson's interesting because he quit before the market made his work shitty, but that doesn't mean that the market always makes work shitty when you sell out to that degree, but it does mean it does happen enough that you have to really know yourself. And he just fucking knew. And he knew that if he was going to start accepting all those awards for his personality, if he was going to kind of go to that next thing that he's talking about in terms of profit, it doesn't have to happen for everyone, but he knew it was going to fuck with him. And he took another path. Yeah. And so I just think that there's a lesson in there for all of us, because also it's not totally pure. It's not like he starved to death. He did extremely well, but he drew a line and then walked away. And I think for all of us in our careers, that if we're privileged enough to have creative careers or careers where we can identify with some aspect of this, part of what we're always asking ourselves is, where do we draw our line? How much of the market are we going to get involved with? But I think the number one mistake is to assume that you can stand apart from it in a way that's like totally pure. You can't. And so here's a guy that was fiercely trying to delimit how much into that space he was going to go. And he erred on the side of saying no. And he preserved this world. And I just want to say that it's so interesting that that choice is so unrecognizable to us. But that it's also, he describes his own world with Calvin Hobbes as magical. And I think that, I don't know what the hell magical means in like that Disney sense, but in this sense, like the magical world of Calvin and Hobbes is a world in which you fought to preserve a space where the characters wrote themselves. Like that to me is just, it's worth our continuous reflection.
Yeah, I agree.
It's why it's such a pleasure to talk about it with you.
Well, thank you, Justin, for your thoughts. This was super fun. It makes me think of like what Conrad is encountering as he's reading these books, because for me, it was encountering, like I mentioned the word stretch, because I was encountering thoughts and ideas that I wasn't really ready for when I was 9 or 10 years old, 11 years old reading this stuff. But it definitely, I'm sitting here on a podcast decades later talking about it, in part because like I am the person that Calvin and Hobbes created. Calvin and Hobbes helped me write myself in some way or another without sounding too corny. But I also think it's funny that like all of the books have like not all of them, but a lot of them have like these sort of introductions from Watterson himself. And I read those as a kid too. And I always knew that the author was always going off about like the business and like,
I didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
I know. I
just
remember that he was always, I was like, this guy always has an axe to grind, like he's always like going after his bosses and everything like that. And I think as a young person, I just thought that was like an interesting element of like whatever this was. But now it's like, God, it's kind of a key to understanding a lot of what he was doing was sort of, giving us a way of thinking about all of that stuff and a way of thinking about it in a really beautiful, graphic, really like adorable and funny and scary set of comics. I love Calvin and Hobbes. In these last weeks, Justin, preparing for this episode, I've just been reading these books and like it didn't feel like prep at all. It felt like just going back to this world that I loved so much as a kid, and still it holds up. This stuff holds up 100%. It actually feels like, I don't know, even better now, if that makes sense.
I agree with all that.
All right, Justin. Well, thanks. We'll see you again very soon, I'm sure.
All right, man. Thank you.
And thank Conrad as well for being on the show.
I will.
Yeah.
I will. He was very excited.
Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guests, Justin and Conrad, for sharing the love of Calvin and Hobbes. I wonder what you guys think of Calvin and Hobbes. Let us know. You can find this on social media or join the conversation at our Patreon. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We're just like Bill Watterson. We feel like there's a purity to the art we do here on the show, and we don't want to sell out to big corporations. So help us out if you appreciate our show, and subscribe at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.